Let's take what we've learned in this chapter and apply it to a specific example. First, to review, the vocabulary that we've learned are analogs. The two things being compared in an argument by analogy are called analogs. The similarities are any properties that the two things are known to have in common. The primary analog is the analog that already has this property Z thing that we're trying to transfer to the other one. And the secondary analog is the analog in the conclusion. It's the one we want to argue does, should, or could also have this property Z, whatever it is. There are 6 ways of analyzing an argument by analogy, 6 factors you have to take into consideration when you're analyzing whether it's good or bad. The relevance of similarities, the number of similarities, the nature and degree of relevant differences, the number of primary analogs, the diversity of primary analogs, and the specificity of the conclusion. So let's apply these to an example. This example actually comes from my real life. So here's this thing about me. I tend to kill plants. I don't mean to. I really like plants. I'm always trying to start a garden, have house plants, stuff like that. Just doesn't work. So I was living in Louisiana at the time in a small town. And I was on vacation in Canada and saw a woman tending her garden, and it was just beautiful. So I stopped and asked her for advice. I would really like to grow a garden like yours, but I tend to kill plants. And she gave me 2 bits of advice. First of all, she said, well, they're plants, they're not kids, so it's okay if you kill them. Learn from your mistakes and move on. Her second bit of advice was, go home and look to see what your neighbor is growing. Whatever your neighbor is growing, you should be able to grow well. So I went home and realized that my neighbor was growing azaleas. So here's my argument. My neighbor grows beautiful azaleas in her yard. Therefore, I should be able to grow beautiful azaleas in my yard too. In this analogy, the two things being compared, the two analogs, are my yard and my neighbor's yard. The property Z that we're trying to transfer from one to the other is growing beautiful azaleas. So that means my neighbor's yard is the primary analog because it already has azaleas. The secondary analog is my yard. It does not have azaleas, and I'm trying to argue that it should be able to have azaleas. I want it to have this property Z. Notice how the argument is phrased. None of the similarities show up, but the woman in Toronto said, go look at your neighbor's yard for a reason, because you have all sorts of similarities between your yard and your neighbor's yard. So some of the similarities are, well, both of our yards have similar soil. There are similar weather conditions in both. When it is sunny in her yard, it's sunny in my yard. When it's rainy in her yard, it's rainy in my yard. We have the same temperature. We have the same growing season. Here are some other similarities. We both had mailboxes in front of our yards. We both had houses on our yards. The houses on our yards both had windows. And the ice cream man would go in front of both of our yards at roughly the same time. Now notice, not all of those similarities are relevant ones. So the first way of analyzing arguments by analogy are to go through all of the similarities and get rid of any that are not relevant. What we mean by relevant here is relevant to the conclusion, relevant to that property Z. In this case, we're talking about azaleas, so we're going to keep all of the similarities that actually help you grow azaleas or have some effect on how azaleas grow. And we're going to get rid of any of the similarities that do not actually affect azaleas. Once you get rid of the irrelevant similarities, then you move on to the second way of analyzing an argument by analogy, the number of similarities. In this case, the more the better. Once you're only looking at the relevant ones, if you have a lot of similarities, that strengthens the argument, and every new similarity you might find, like the same wildlife in both yards, every new similarity is going to strengthen that. So let's go over the relevant differences between her yard and my yard. Her yard has trees, my yard does not. She bought soil at a gardening store, and I did not. She is a skilled and attentive gardener, and I tend to kill plants. I hired a professional gardener just to grow azaleas, whereas she has to do her gardening for herself. Now notice we have to look at both the nature and the degree of these relevant differences. The degree of the relevant differences just means how strong is the difference. Her yard has trees, mine has no trees. This was a high degree of difference because she had a lot of big trees. Now if she had one small tree in the corner, that would be a lower degree of difference. Her buying soil, when I do not, that's a pretty high degree of difference. And notice that overcomes one of our similarities. We had listed similar soil as one of the similarities that was strengthening it. If she's buying soil, that changes that. She is a skilled and attentive gardener, and I am not. This has a very high degree of difference. And I hire a professional gardener and pay him specifically to grow azaleas in my yard. This has a very high degree of difference as well. All right, now let's look at the nature of the relevant disanalogies, because if you look at these differences, notice some of these differences favor her, some of them favor me. The nature of relevant differences essentially means who wins. Here are the ones where she wins. She buys soil at the garden store, and I do not. She is a skilled and attentive gardener. I am not. These both weaken the analogy. It makes it harder for me to get to the conclusion because she has these advantages, so it weakens the argument. Now, when I hire a professional gardener, paying him specifically to grow azaleas in my yard, this does weaken the analogy because the two yards are different. However, it makes it easier for me to get to the conclusion. So overall, it strengthens the argument. Now, the difference that we haven't looked at yet is her yard had trees and mine did not. In this case, we don't know who wins because different plants like different levels of sunshine or shade, and I have no idea what azaleas prefer. Even though we don't know who wins with this difference, it's still going to weaken the analogy and therefore weaken the argument. So, with differences, if the primary analog wins, it weakens the argument. If the secondary analog wins, it actually strengthens the argument. If we don't know who wins, it still weakens the argument. Now, a few more things we look at. The number of primary analogs. Are there other houses in the neighborhood that also have azaleas? And in this particular town, every house on the street except for mine was growing beautiful azaleas. In fact, most of the houses, apartment complexes, stores in the town also had beautiful azaleas, and I'm not lying about this, they actually had an azalea festival once a year. So there were lots of primary analogs. This shows that growing azaleas in that climate is not something specific about my neighbor. So the more primary analogs you have, the stronger the argument. Once you have a lot of primary analogs, then you look at the diversity of primary analogs. If the different houses with azaleas are different from each other, that strengthens the argument quite a bit. So, people with lots of trees, a few trees, and no trees all had beautiful azaleas. People who had gardening skills and people who had no interest or skill in gardening at all also had beautiful azaleas. People all over the town, on the hills, in the valleys, close to the river, far from the river, small rocky yards or large not so rocky yards, they all had beautiful azaleas. So this strengthens the analogy a lot. And by this point in our argument, this is a very strong argument by analogy. The last thing we want to look at is the specificity of the conclusion. How specific is your conclusion? The original argument, remember, said, my neighbor grows beautiful azaleas in her yard, therefore I should be able to grow beautiful azaleas in my yard too. That's not bad. The conclusion is not that specific. I'm just saying I should be able to have, nice flowers too. What if I change it to this? My neighbor grows beautiful azaleas in her yard, therefore I should be able to grow azaleas just as beautiful as hers. This weakens the argument. I've made the conclusion more specific, so the argument itself is weaker. If I change it to, I should be able to grow azaleas more beautiful than hers, I've completely destroyed the argument. I have no evidence that I will actually outperform my neighbor with the azaleas. So, the more specific your conclusion, the weaker the argument. However, if you go in the opposite direction and make it less specific, you strengthen your argument. If I change my conclusion to, I should be able to at least keep azaleas alive for a year until they get their first flowers, I now have a very strong argument. So those are the 6 ways of analyzing an argument by analogy.